Right, we are live for this week's masterclass with high performance expert Michael Hanson, who is the founder and CEO of Growth Genie. I'm really excited about this because, this is, as sales professionals, we spend so much time on crafting our messaging and driving outbound activities. Like, what is the kind of perfect cadence? What is the best structure? What are the fundamentals to get right? And I'm excited that Michael's going to be sharing some of his insights. The great thing about him, he does this day in, day out. He's a founder and CEO himself, so he's applied these tactics to building his own business, but has also had a career advising other sales professionals, sales leaders, and businesses scale their marketing and sales activities. So, Michael, thanks for joining us today, and I will hand over the mic to you.
Yeah, appreciate the invite, James, and look forward to discussing cadences with everyone who's going to listen to this. As James said, I'm Michael Hanson, based in London, and on that note, I am in the middle of London, so you may hear some sirens sometimes in the background, so forgive me for that. Let's get into today's topic, which is around sales cadences. So just before I get into what is the cadence, because I know some people listening to this maybe experienced SDRs, so you know a lot about cadences, but some of you may be new. So I'll cover what exactly is a cadence, but just brief background on myself. Today is not about me, it's about cadences, but just so you know who is this random guy, Michael, who's talking to you. So essentially, Growth Genie, what we do, we're outsourced sales enablement. So we build playbooks and cadences for fast-growing companies, which is why James invited me on today. And then we also coach and train SDRs, AEs, and CSMs. How did I kind of get this experience? So before setting up Growth Genie, which I did 3 years ago, I used to work for a company called CloudTask, and they do outsource sales services. So we were also building cadences for hundreds of companies and kind of seeing what worked and what didn't work. And last thing on Growth Genie is that we are modern and traditional. So what I mean by that is that we still believe in what some people may call old school tactics, so cold calling, but we also use things like videos, voice notes, LinkedIn. So these are all things I'm going to be touching on today. So, like I said, wanted to first explain exactly what is a cadence. You may also hear the term sequence sometimes, which is essentially the same thing, but it's the touch points that you're going to use in order to get in touch with someone and try and get a meeting or at least have a conversation with them. Typical cadence is going to involve phone calls, emails, and then LinkedIn steps. And you need to obviously decide what's the messaging you want in each of these steps and how many of the steps do you want to do. So those are some things that we're going to be talking about today. Now, having written hundreds of cadences, worked with hundreds of clients on their cadences, normally what I see goes wrong is actually with the people you're targeting, because everything is related to this, right? So this is like, if you imagine like a Jenga board, this is like the base, right? Your ideal customer profile. So if this is wrong, everything else is going to fall down. So it's really important. What I say is that you go niche on your ideal customer profile. So I'm going to be giving some examples of that. But what you don't want to do is a spray and pray approach where you're trying to target everyone. You want to go very niche. So how do you go niche, right? So I like to think of three things, right? Which is the job titles you're going after, the industries, and then the triggers. So like in the case of James or I, we sell to CEOs of smaller businesses or VPs of sales, VPs of marketing. So that's kind of the role they're in. But then what type of company do they work for, right? Is it manufacturing? Is it logistics? Is it software? And then finally, this is what we find is really important, which is what we call triggers, right? So essentially, whenever you contact someone outbound, cold outbound, they don't know who you are. They always think, why is this person contacting me? I don't know who they are. And the trigger is your reason for getting in touch with them. So some classic triggers that we see work quite well is someone's hiring a particular job role that you can help with. Someone is using a particular software that you have expertise in, or someone's new in their role. That's always a good one. Funding it's good to target people that have funding, but what we don't recommend is saying, hey, congrats on your funding, because everyone else says that. So target them, but mention something different related to growth. Now, with this ideal customer profile, what we recommend is trying to have at least 2 of the 3 segments, right? So you may not have triggers, but you may want to target them based on the persona and the vertical they're in. Otherwise, what's going to happen is you're going to have a weak ideal customer profile. So let's go into that now. So if I'm talking about my own business, I may run a campaign where I'm going to say, I'm going to target anyone in the world that's a sales leader, sales manager, VP of sales. And I could say, hey, Jeff, noticed you're a sales leader. Imagine you have tough targets for your team. So this message is okay, probably better than what most people send, but we can go a lot more specific on this. So I'm going to now put all 3 of the pillars. So operations director is a job title, sales outsourcer is the industry, and then hiring SDR is a trigger event. Now, because I've gone more specific on the ideal customer profile, the message I'm going to use when I contact them is also more specific. So Jeff, notice you're hiring SDRs, trigger event, as an ops director in the outsourcing world. So you can see this messaging is a lot more relevant. And then here I've got the pain point that's associated with that. So ensuring SDRs across multiple accounts hit their targets can be a tough job. So as you can see, there's a big difference between this messaging, which is more kind of spray and pray, and this messaging, which is a lot more specific. And that's all related to the fact that I've gone after a more specific ICP. Now, the other thing I always talk about is when you're deciding who should I target, who are my ideal customers, you can work backwards from your case studies, because if you have lots of case studies, say in manufacturing, you should probably go after manufacturing companies because you've got stories you can talk about. But if you say, oh, I want to target people in the hospitality industry, but you don't have any case studies there, it's going to be quite difficult for you. So always recommend trying to target companies where you have case studies. And essentially what a case study is really a customer story, right? So if any of you, well, I'm sure all of you watching this have seen a film or a movie in your life. And normally in a movie, there's always a hero and a villain, right? So the villain essentially in your customer story is whatever challenges the company was facing before they worked. And then obviously your company and the customer is the hero that comes along and makes everyone's life easier. Now, again, what I wanted to do is show you like what does bad look like and what does good look like. So this is a case study we have on our website about a company called Operatics, who we help build sales playbooks and cadences like we're talking about today. If I just talk about that, I'm talking about features, right? We help Operatics build playbooks and cadences. I'm not talking about the before and the after, right? There's kind of no villain in this story. So now I'm going to go into a little bit more detail. One, explain who Operatics are, a sales outsourcer. They were growing very quickly, onboarding lots of new clients. And now I talk about the problem, but they were struggling with building the messaging to support this growth, which was taking them 5 weeks before their SDRs could be up and running. So this is a state before, and then the results after. With that, they were able to have SDRs live on accounts within 2 weeks versus 5, and they increased their renewal rate by 25%. And this was thanks to our playbooks and cadences. So you can see now this is more of a story. It's got a before state and it's got an after state. Some of you may be thinking this is still quite long, and we're going to be talking about in emails, which should be very short. How do we narrow this down? How do we make shorter messaging in our emails? I'll come on to that in a bit. Now, so at this point, based on your case studies and your ideal customers, you know who you're targeting. So like in our case, as I said, VPs of sales, hiring SDRs, they're in software. So I know a niche ideal customer profile that I want to go after. Now I've decided that, this is when you decide, okay, what are the touch points that I'm going to do across these different channels, and what am I going to say? So I'm going to focus on the touch points to start on the structure, and then I'm going to come on to the messaging after. So we have a cadence, which if you go on our website, you'll see called the Ultimate Outbound Sales Cadence. And I think it's our most popular bit of content, not because it's the most amazing bit of content in the world, but I think it's a bit of a shock factor because it has between 20 and 30 touches. Most people are typically doing 10 to 15. So a lot of people are really shocked by this. Like, wow, how can you have so many touch points? So essentially it's 10 to 15 calls, 6 to 8 LinkedIn messages, and 6 to 8 emails. The LinkedIn bit is a bit deceiving because this is only if they accept your connection request. So typically not many people are going to do that. But a lot of this is based on data, like having a very high number of touch points. So I can tell you cold calling still works, right? We work with hundreds of SDRs that still get lots of meetings doing cold calls. But we also know that people pick up their phone a lot less than they used to do 10, 20 years ago. And this is shown by a connect rate, right? So the connect rate is essentially the number of people that answer their phone. And for a cold call, it's currently 5%. And if you go back 10 years, that would be 10%. So the number of people picking up their phone, especially to strangers, is going down. Now, also the average open rate on cold emails is 20%. Again, this has gone down loads. I was reading a study that the number of emails that a C-level person receives, so it's CTO, CFO, etc., is double what it was pre-pandemic. So it just means email inboxes are really cluttered, and that's made the open rate go down. And then generally, LinkedIn acceptance request, if it's someone who you don't know, is 20%. Now, of course, we want to aim for higher than this. This is like industry standards. So I'm going to be teaching you some tactics about how you can do it. One of the things a tip I would give you when it comes to cold emails is try not to put links in your emails. And one of the reasons you don't want to put links in your emails is often they'll get you sent to spam, because if you've ever been hacked or anything like that, normally it comes because you click on some type of link. So most business emails, if they see a link, they see a threat of spam. So when you're writing emails, if you've got any type of marketing content, write a snippet of what's in it. Don't actually link to it. Now, as I said, a lot of people are shocked by this. A lot of SDRs like yourself that we work with say, oh, this is crazy. This is too many touch points. But I always say, forget sales for a minute. Think about communication in general. How many times does a family member call you, a colleague, and you miss it, right? Because you're busy? Or how many times do you get an email and you don't reply to it, even though you know the person? Or LinkedIn is like really messy as well. I often miss things on LinkedIn. So just think about that. Just keep going. And the thing I always say is the majority of time, unless your messaging is absolutely terrible, it's not because people aren't interested. It's just because they're busy. And that's where persistence comes into play. And I'm going to be showing you some examples of me having success by being persistent today. Now, before we get into the what, which is like, what are we going to put in these messages? I just wanted to talk about some more unconventional channels. So I earlier mentioned LinkedIn, I mentioned calls, and I mentioned emails. So a few other channels we recommend are videos. So there's some really good free video tools that you can use. Vidyard and Loom are two that we know about, but I know there's lots more out there. And essentially, it just helps you be different, right? Because the majority of messages that people receive are just plain text. So by using your voice and your face, it just helps you stand out from the noise. Voice notes as well. Some of you listening to this, you may have sent voice notes on WhatsApp, but you can actually also send voice notes on LinkedIn. So this is something I really recommend. And we see unbelievable increases in response rates by doing this. Again, it's just different. And then SMS as well. So I think the average open rate for an SMS text is 90% from a stranger, which is compare that to 20% for an email. So I always say I pretty much open all SMSs that I get, whereas it's rare that I open a cold email unless it's a really good subject line. Now, I wanted to come into the what, right? So what are we going to put in these emails? So the first thing to note is generally, there's a lot of data around the fact that shorter emails work best. And psychologically, imagine you're a buyer, you don't know who the person is. You're not going to spend like 3 minutes reading their email. You're just going to scan it very quickly. So I recommend keeping your emails under 100 words. And then this goes back to the point I was talking about your ideal customer profile. Put yourself in their shoes. Think about, is this relevant to their job title? Is this relevant to the company they work for? Is this relevant to the trigger event, stuff that's happening at their companies? So always put yourself in their shoes and take yourself away from what you're trying to sell. So be customer centric and not product centric. And I'm going to give you some examples of that. Now, final point before I show you some examples is a lot of SDRs and even account executives that I work with, they have this almost like alter ego where they don't talk to prospects the way they would talk to their friends. So I say, if these are words you wouldn't use in normal life, then don't say it in like a sales email or on a sales call. So things like optimize efficiencies, automate process, circling back. People use these very strange words and they're very common. And again, if you use these words in sales emails, you're just going to one, sound weird, and two, sound like everyone else. So I don't recommend using these. And then when it comes to your calls to action, so again, on the subject of being different, is the majority of people will ask for time, right? So they will say at the end of a cold email, do you have 15 minutes for a demo? Do you have 30 minutes for a demo? Now, Gong did this really interesting study, which was based on, I think it's 500,000 cold emails that were sent out. And what they found was that you got twice as many reply rates by asking for interest versus asking for time. The psychology behind this is that a busy CEO or CTO, for example, they've only got 40 hours a week. Or say they work more than everyone else, even if they're working 50, 60, it's still a limited amount of time, but you can be interested in many different things. So essentially you can be interested in a lot of things, but you only have a certain number of hours a week. So that's kind of the psychology behind it. Now let's see how this plays out in practice. So this is an example of a typical email that we send that gets us results. And as James said at the start, we very much practice what we preach. We're still a small company of 5 people, but when I first set up the company, I had to do outbound to get my own customers. And this is the type of messaging that I was using. So the first thing, your open rate is essentially really around your subject line. Now with your subject line, all you're trying to do is create curiosity. So here you can see Tim's SDRs. The reason I've put that is because I know the company's hiring SDRs. So that means that's top of mind for them. Now, another thing I recommend in your emails is try to use the word you and your as much as possible. Ban yourself from saying I or we, because essentially if you say I or we, you're talking about yourself, and what you really want to do is talk about the person that you're reaching out to. So in this case, I put that trigger event. Notice you're hiring SDRs at Growth Gazette. Then I want to talk about some type of pain that's related to hiring SDRs. So I put it can take up to 4 months before an SDR is fully productive at a software company. And this is that interest call to action. Interested in a playbook template that can help you onboard new hires twice as fast. So you see this is quite interesting as well, because even though I'm using the interest call to action, I'm not saying interested in a demo, I'm trying to give them something first, right? So to explain the psychology of that, this really goes into what we call the rule of reciprocity, which is essentially if you give something to someone that's of value to them, you've built trust, right? So if they reply to me and say, yes, I would like the playbook template, then maybe I can give them a call and say, oh, well, by the way, one of the things we do is actually build playbooks. How are you building playbooks, right? So always think whenever you're reaching out to someone, what can you give them? Because salespeople, we're either trying to take time if you're an SDR. As salespeople who are closing, we're trying to take money. Or even on calls, often we're trying to take information off people and we're not thinking, what can we give in return? What can we give to this person to make their life easier? Now, depending on where you're working, you may have some type of automation tool, which sometimes are called sales engagement tools. So we are big on personalization, as you would have seen in my previous email, but we also like to combine personalization and automation. So normally the second email that we send is essentially what we call a bump email. that's just replying to the previous email. And we recommend it just being one line. The reason it's just one line is that you want the person to be able to see the message below that was in the first email, right? And again, the reason behind this is that a lot of the people you reach out to, they're really busy. So they may have not seen your email because they're out of office. They may have not seen your email because they're busy with internal matters, or often what happens is they open it and they're like, oh, that's interesting, but they didn't have time to reply. And I often see this myself because we work with, chief revenue officers, chief marketing officers, and they often send me emails like, oh, look how good this email was that I received. And then I said, oh, how was the demo? Did you take the meeting? And they were like, oh, no, I was too busy. I forgot to reply, but I'm sure they'll follow up with me. But often people don't follow up. So it just goes to show often people don't respond, not because they're not interested, but just because they're really busy. Now, so the first email I talked about was around kind of what we call a content giveaway, that rule of reciprocity. What can I give away for free? So this is going a little bit more into the direct around what we do at Growth Genie. But again, I'm not talking about sales consulting. I'm talking about case studies. So this is where the case study is going to come into play. So here I put market styles reply rate. The reason that I put that is I know reply rate is something that sales leaders and marketing leaders are always looking into. And again, the trigger event is on the first line. Saw you're new in your role as CRO at MarketStar. So we work with hundreds of companies, and generally this is a really good trigger event that we see works well across industries. So even if you're selling to CTOs, engineering directors, this is something that we see works quite well. Again, then the challenge. Since you announced the job change, you must have been bombarded with spam. So put yourself in your SDR's shoes. Imagine how difficult it is for them. And again, that interest call to action. But what we're talking about this time is some type of case study, interested in learning how our playbooks 3 times the reply rate for demand gen. So this is essentially more of a direct approach, trying to get interest in some type of case study. And again, once you've done a personalized email, always bump it up with just a one-liner. And again, this is just something you can do on any type of sales automation tool. So we really recommend in your cadences combining personalization and automation. And that way you can have both quality and quantity. Now, so far I've talked about 4 touches. I'm not going to talk about all like 25, 30 touches we have in our cadence, but I wanted to show this one. So this is actually an example of a last touch email. Now, you may speak with a lot of other SDRs or people in your company, and they recommend doing a breakup email, which is essentially the last email in your cadence. We like to change that round a bit. So actually what we do is we have what we call a feedback email, right? So essentially, the feedback email is trying to be a bit humble and say, hey, you're a sales leader. So I'm always trying to speak to sales leaders like you and have a favor to ask. Do you mind sharing some feedback on my outreach? Again, you may be selling to CTOs, engineering leaders, so you can drop that there. But it's this approach of actually asking for feedback. Now, this is actually a real life example. And this, interestingly enough, he didn't give me feedback, but he actually booked a meeting with me. And this was last year, and they ended up becoming one of our biggest customers last year. And you can even put, he even put, P.S. I guess this email proves the please help approach can work. Now, what's interesting about this kind of approach is there's 3 things that can happen. One is obviously they don't respond. 2 is they give you feedback. So even if I didn't book a meeting, if he gave me feedback, it would be great because it's like market research. I can learn about what's in the mind of CMOs, CROs, or like this. I've had a few meetings booked like this, and then a lot of our clients who are selling to IT directors, data science, they've liked this approach as well, and have also booked meetings. Now, I've talked a lot about email. The approach on LinkedIn and email is going to be quite similar. LinkedIn is just going to be even shorter messages because LinkedIn is more of a chat platform. But I want to talk about calling as well. So you could do a whole session on calling, which I'm sure James will organize a module on that. But just the tip I wanted to give you around calling, because we're talking about cadences here, is a lot of people ask me the question like, what's your favorite channel? Is it phone? Is it email? Is it LinkedIn? And I always say, I think it's the wrong type of question. I think you need to be omnichannel because your buyers are living in different places, right? So this is an example here. So when this guy replied with this message, Mike Sheridan, even though it was an email that got his attention, what I noticed is his phone number was in the signature. So I gave him a call straight away and I was able to book the meeting that way. And it was just quicker because the thing is with the phone, it's the only interactive channel, right? You can ask questions on the spot versus like I could have asked for his time, sent him a calendar link, and that can take weeks. So it's still better to try and call someone to book that meeting. But of course, not everyone's going to be like Mike Sheridan, right? Mike Sheridan was basically saying, I'm interested, let's have a meeting. But you may get some replies that are not as positive with some objections, right? So this is another example that I have with essentially a chief revenue officer that replied to me saying, look, this is interesting, but my plan is to find the head of BDR. So if I had to break this down into like a common sales objection, it's essentially, this is not the right time, right? So what you want to do in those situations, again, if you get an objection by email, is call the person. And as I said, often their phone number is in the signature. The reason you want to call them is the best way to deal with objections is to understand versus overcome objections. So what I did is I asked him some questions around this objection. Understand you're trying to find a head of BDR. What are you looking for in that head of BDR? How long is it going to take you? And we had a conversation and he realized it could take them up to 6 months. Identify the challenge. And then again, this was a CRO that was actually able to turn into a customer. And I think if I tried to do that on email, it would have been quite difficult. So basically, the moral of the story here is whenever you get an objection by email, call the person straight away. Now, especially on calls, this is important. When you've got someone on the call and you go in, you have a good conversation, identify challenges, you book the meeting, it can be really exciting, especially when you first started as an SDR. But your job is not over at that point because if you're in business-to-business sales, typically there's 10 people involved in any decision. So you want to try and get as many people as possible on that first call. And the salesperson or account executive that you're booking that meeting for is going to be really happy with you if you get like 2, 3, 4 people on that call. So I always recommend asking who else is typically involved in, say you're selling mobile engineering decisions. Or a bit of a funnier way of saying it is like, would anyone else be offended from your company if they weren't on this call? So always try and ask these questions because the more people you get on that first meeting, the more likely it is to end up becoming a customer. And even though your job is to book meetings, of course, ultimately, the final goal is to have revenue for your company. Now, I haven't talked too much about LinkedIn today. As I mentioned earlier, the structure you're going to use in your LinkedIn message is similar to what we talked about before. Your trigger event, your reason for getting in touch, your pain point, and then like an interest call to action. But what we don't recommend is doing that in your connection request. So in your connection request, I see it like a subject line almost, right? You're just trying to create curiosity so that someone accepts your connection request. And a really good thing I recommend to get people to accept your connection request is to drop the name of a colleague. So this is like a template I have that works really well. It says, so this guy was a CEO and I had a conversation with his colleague who is the BDR manager and said, Johannes, been having some interesting convos with your colleague Teresa. Be great to connect her. And then he accepted that, and I'd open dialogue with the CEO, which was someone who was also involved in the buying chain. So yeah, recommend not just on LinkedIn, but even if you're cold calling, emailing, if you speak to one person at a company, have a good conversation, mention their name when you speak to someone else. So yeah, that is it. James, I don't know if we've got any.
Yeah, we have. If there's any questions, put them into the chat. I'm just curious, what from your business setup, what tools do you use? Like, what's your CRM? What do you use for sales cadences? And what do you see in other companies that's most common?
Yeah, sure. So internally, we use Apollo. So we're a very small company. What we like about Apollo is you can run sequences, cadences, but it also has data. So it has like emails, phone numbers, etc. What we see with most of our clients is they use either Outreach or Salesloft. They're probably the two biggest vendors in the market. And then as a CRM, we use HubSpot. Again, we see most of our clients use Salesforce as a CRM.
This is more, I might probably take this one offline, but I'm just curious for me on so does Apollo integrate with HubSpot?
Yeah, Apollo does integrate with HubSpot. Yeah.
So if you've got Apollo and HubSpot, you don't need Salesloft or the other one.
No.
Okay, that's helpful. That is good to know. Tamira's got a question. How many days do you typically leave between touches, calls, emails, LinkedIn, etc.?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. We typically do 2 or 3 days. So we're trying to do at least like contacting the leads twice, 2 or 3 times a week, right? So maybe like Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Tuesday, Friday. The other thing to bear in mind is your cadence is more of a structure, because sometimes I see SDRs get stressed out because they don't do their task. If you can't get to the task today, no problem, you can do it tomorrow. So sometimes you may have a week between touches, but it's not a big deal as long as you still keep going and do those touches.
How do you refine like the amount of leads that are in the cadences? One thing I'm doing at the moment, because I'm building this membership, I'm doing a lot of like first emails because I'm building the data, sticking it in. I'm yet to set up proper cadences, so this is useful for me. Yeah. But I'm wondering, like, once you start getting the cadence flow going, how many contacts are like typically going through the cadences, and does that just grow, or do you focus on a certain number for a certain period of time?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So there's a few things here. One is you may have lists of leads, right? So I was talking about automation and personalization. You may, if you've got like, say you sell to enterprise companies, big companies and smaller companies, maybe for smaller companies, you have a fully automated cadence. You may just press a button and you just send them loads of emails. You don't bother with calls or LinkedIn. And that may be 200 leads. But then you may have more of like an enterprise cadence, and you may have 100 leads in there. And then probably you can get through maximum 30 to 50 a day. So you would just rotate. So like Monday, you contact a third of your list. Tuesday, you contact the other third. Wednesday, you contact the other third. So you basically like rotate by days.
Gotcha. That's helpful. Okay, questions are coming in. I told you they were keen. So on the follow-up, how long is a cadence overall before you put them into a nurture? So I guess, like, I think, Tamir, if you want to clarify the question now, but I think what you're asking is what length of time is the cadence going on for until you give up and then they go somewhere else?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So typically our cadences are like 3 to 4 weeks. As I said, you may fall behind because you go to an event or like something happens in your life, you go on holiday and you just pick it up again. So it may end up being 5, 6 weeks, but we aim for like 3 to 4 weeks.
Okay, so if you basically haven't heard from them, got any responses on phone or email, you kind of park that contact lead for now, revisit later on in the year.
Exactly. Yeah. And the other reason I don't like the term breakup email is because you will just because someone doesn't reply doesn't mean they're not interested. So we recommend setting a reminder in like 2 to 3 months and contacting them again.
Yeah, I agree. Like, I mean, at the end of the day, to your point that you made a few times on this, timing is everything. And why they ignored you completely for that month, 3 months later, they're a different person, different problems or whatever, it might be a more suitable time. Exactly. Andrea's asking, I mean, this is probably across industries, and I think you did mention the average open rate of email. Was it 20%?
Yeah, it's 20%. That's for cold emails. You should be aiming for higher. We always say to our clients, they should be aiming like above 30%. What's interesting as well, I can give you some data around our internal cadences. Now, we average about 40 to 50%, which is still impressive, like per email, like per first touch email. But over the course of 7 to 8 emails, 80% of people we're contacting are opening. So that's why we recommend doing the multiple touches, because some people will be busy your first, second email, but they'll open like your third or fourth email.
Okay, that's helpful. If you get an objection over email, but you do not have their phone number, what is the next action?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, because obviously I was recommending you call them. If you can't call them, I think sending a video is quite a good tactic. So that's what I talked about. Again, you're using your voice. It's a bit more kind of diplomatic, because what you don't want to do with objections is like fight the person. To say, oh, understand, like I said before, it's not the right time. Typically what we're seeing, and then you can go into some of the challenges, like how are you overcoming those challenges yourself? So yeah, videos can be quite a nice, if you can't get them on the phone, a video is quite a nice way of overcoming the objection.
Crikey, I mean, Andreas just said he would love to see 20%. Currently his SDRs are below 3%.
Yeah, so obviously you need to look into your messaging, but I would also look into your email deliverability. So if you Google stuff around sender score, that's essentially how likely you are to get sent to spam, and as well as your messaging, it may be related to that. Oh.
Could be interesting. I think you might have someone interested, Michael. Question from Tamir, another one. In your personal experience, what's the most success rate as a first touch response, email or phone? Like, where do you get the most response reactive to that first touch? What's most likely to get a response?
Yeah, it totally depends on the person, right? So this is what I said earlier. We recommend the omni-channel because, like, when we do outbound ourselves, we get a mixture of meetings from cold calls, from emails, and they're all related, because you may email someone and then you give them a call and they're like, oh, I just saw your email. It was really interesting. So I recommend doing both. Normally in our cadency, we would be like, look on LinkedIn, try find some type of trigger event, which is your excuse to get in touch. Give them a call. Most people aren't going to answer, and then you can send them an email.
Cool. I mean, this is like, to me, you must love it, Day-Day, because this is the whole top of funnel game, right? Like, no one can do any business unless you get this right. So, it's super interesting. It's an area that I'm personally kind of working on right now. To get more activities. The other question I had around cadences. Is the cadence? Are you automating it in Apollo? I.e., if a response doesn't come, or are you having to kind of click tasks based on what's happened before, or does it just happen in the cadence?
Yeah, so it depends if you're doing personalization or automation. So basically, say we've got like a 8-touch cadence. Normally only 2 of those messages are personalized. So if it's a personalized message, a task will come up like write personalized note. Okay. But then the follow-up, say you've got 100 leads in your cadence, you just press a button and say, send them the same message. So we do a mixture of automation and personalization.
Gotcha. All right, is it just before we wrap up, any more questions? Please ask them now. If not, I've invited Michael to the dinner, so I'm sure there'll be further talks if he can make that on the 26th. Michael, really appreciate this session. Our recording will go. So if you're watching this for the first time and you're a new member and you want to learn more about Michael directly, connect with him on LinkedIn. Look, he's on the money. There's his LinkedIn link. And also appreciate your time and effort, especially to this new membership. We are getting very excited about how it's growing. So thank you, Michael.
Awesome. No, thanks a lot, James. And as you said, feel free to connect on LinkedIn and hopefully see people around soon.
Awesome. Take care. Cheers, Michael.
All right. Cheers.
Cheers all. Bye.